The coat check girl almost didn't give it back to him. That's the part nobody talks about. Not the part that ended up in the papers. Not the part that got replayed on 3 different news segments. Not the moment that made a room full of senators and hedge fund managers go completely, absolutely silent. The part nobody talks about is the coat check girl, 19 years old, working her second week at the Hargrove Grand, who looked at the man standing in front of her. Gray uniform, name tag slightly crooked, a pair of reading glasses folded into his breast pocket, and said, "Sir, this area is for guests only." His name was Lionel Greer. He handed her the ticket without a word, ticket number 47. She found the coat, a charcoal wool overcoat, the kind that costs more than most people's rent, and held it for a moment longer than she needed to, looking at the ticket, looking at him, back at the ticket. Then she handed it over and went back to her phone. Lionel Greer put on the coat, buttoned it slowly, and walked out into the lobby of the Hargrove Grand Hotel without looking back. He did that a lot, walking out of rooms without looking back. 3 hours earlier, Lionel Greer had been on his hands and knees in the service corridor behind the main ballroom, resealing a section of baseboard that had buckled from a water leak the week before. It was the kind of work that the Hargrove Grand needed done, but never wanted to see being done. Invisible labor, meant to happen between midnight and 6 in the morning, or else tucked so far into the back corridors that the guests would never catch a glimpse. Lionel had been on the maintenance staff for 14 months. Before that, he'd been somewhere else entirely. He didn't talk about before. The other guys on the crew knew not to ask. Darnell, who ran the overnight team, had tried once, early on. "You do this kind of work before?" he'd asked, watching Lionel assess a section of damaged drywall with the calm focus of a man who had looked at far more complicated problems and found them manageable. Lionel had said, "Some version of it," and that was the end of that. What Darnell didn't know, what nobody at the Hargrove Grand knew, was that Lionel Greer had spent 22 years as a structural engineer. Not a draftsman, not a project manager, the kind of engineer whose name went on the plaques, bridges, a federal courthouse in Maryland, a hospital wing in Atlanta that had been written up in 2 architecture journals and praised specifically for what the writer called an almost instinctive understanding of how weight wants to move through space. He had taught for 6 years at a university in North Carolina. He had consulted on the renovation of a building in Washington, D.C. that he was not, contractually, allowed to name, but that appeared on television almost every time the president gave an address to the nation. He was 53 years old, and he was on his hands and knees resealing a baseboard at the Hargrove Grand Hotel, and he had his reasons, and they were his. The crew was supposed to be clear of the main event spaces by 6. The Whitfield Foundation Gala started at 7:30. Lionel finished the baseboard at 5:48, gathered his materials, and was rolling his cart back toward the service elevator when the wheel caught on something. A ripple in the carpet, a nothing, and the cart tilted, and a metal tray slid off and hit the floor with a sound that echoed all the way down the corridor. He stood there for a moment, then he heard it. The ballroom doors were not fully closed. Someone was doing a sound check, or maybe just warming up, because coming through the gap in those doors was piano music. Not the background noise kind, not the hotel lobby kind. Someone was playing Ravel, Gaspard de la Nuit. The third movement, Scarbo, which is one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire, the kind of thing that makes professional pianists nervous just thinking about it. Lionel Greer stood in the service corridor with his hand on the tilted cart and listened. He stood there for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. He knew because he checked his watch when he finally made himself move again. He did not go through the doors. He went back to the service elevator, took it down to the basement, and clocked out. The Whitfield Foundation Gala was, in the words of the woman who organized it, a formidably efficient woman named Sandra Obi, who had been running high-end nonprofit events for 18 years, the crown jewel of the spring calendar. 400 guests. Senators, federal judges, the kind of CEOs who had their own foundations within foundations. Old money that had been old money so long it had stopped remembering what it used to be, sitting next to new money that was still in the process of figuring out how to look like it had always been there. The host was a man named Clifford Hartwell. Clifford Hartwell was 61 years old and had made his fortune in commercial real estate development, specifically in the kind of development that transformed neighborhood so completely that the people who had lived there for generations could no longer afford to stay. He had opinions about this that he shared frequently, and without much interest in counter-argument. He gave generously to the Whitfield Foundation, which funded arts education programs in underserved communities, a fact he mentioned at every opportunity, and which he appeared to find sufficient evidence that he was, on balance, one of the good ones. Hartwell arrived at the Hargrove Grand at 7:15, 45 minutes before the gala began, which was 45 minutes before he needed to be there, which meant he was the kind of man who liked to establish ownership of a space before other people filled it. He walked through the lobby. He did not acknowledge the staff, not the concierge, not the bellman who held the door, not the woman arranging flowers near the entrance to the ballroom, who had been arranging those flowers for 2 hours and would spend another hour after the gala broke down the display and would be paid less per hour than the cost of one of the centerpiece roses. Hartwell had 2 people with him. His assistant, a young man named Prescott, who carried a tablet and spoke in half sentences that Hartwell finished, and a woman named Virginia Hartwell, his wife of 26 years, who walked 2 steps behind him in a manner that suggested this was not something anyone had told her to do, but something that had simply become true over time. He moved through the space the way men like Clifford Hartwell always moved through spaces they were paying for. Slowly, with the particular confidence of someone who has decided in advance that everything is below his expectations, but that he will tolerate it. He found a problem with the lighting over the main table. He found a problem with the temperature of the room. He found a problem with the way the chairs were arranged, which he expressed to Sandra Obi in the tone of a man sharing a helpful observation, which was the worst possible tone because it meant she could not push back without seeming unreasonable. Sandra Obi adjusted the chairs and said nothing. She had adjusted chairs for men like Clifford Hartwell for 18 years. She was very good at it. At 7:22, Hartwell walked to the front of the room where the grand piano sat, a Steinway concert grand, brought in specifically for the evening's entertainment, black and enormous and almost obscenely beautiful, and he placed his hand on the lid. He didn't play. He just stood there with his hand on the piano, like he was posing for something. Then he walked away. Lionel Greer came back 7:40. This was not planned. He would tell you that himself later. He came back because he had left his reading glasses in the service corridor. The good pair, the ones his daughter had given him for his birthday 2 years ago. The ones he kept meaning to get a case for, and he needed them for the early shift the next morning. He badged in through the service entrance, found the glasses exactly where he thought he'd left them, tucked near the baseboard he'd resealed, and was making his way back through the service corridor when he heard the music again. Different piece this time. Something slower. Something he recognized but couldn't name immediately, the way you sometimes can't name a face until a specific memory attaches to it. Then it came to him, Barber, the Adagio for strings, arranged for piano. He had heard it played live exactly once before, at a concert in Chapel Hill in 1998, and he had sat in his seat afterward for a long time before he trusted himself to stand up. The ballroom doors were open. The gala was underway. The pianist, a young woman, Korean-American, in a dark green dress, was playing during the cocktail hour while guests moved around her like water around a stone, drinks in hand, not listening. Lionel stood at the edge of the service entrance and watched. He should have left. His glasses were in his pocket. There was no reason to stay. But across the room, past the guests and the centerpieces and the servers moving with their trays, he could see the Steinway. And without quite deciding to do it, he was walking toward it. Not because he intended to play. He would be very clear about this later. He walked toward it the way you walk toward something that has always been yours and was briefly taken away. Not with intention, with memory. He reached the piano. He sat down. The bench was the wrong height. He adjusted it without thinking, the automatic calibration of someone who has done this 10,000 times. His hands rested on the keys. The pianist in the green dress was still playing across the room. Nobody had noticed him. He played one chord, just one, soft enough that it barely reached past the keyboard. But he felt it go through him like electricity, and he closed his eyes. He played 3 bars of something. He didn't know what, exactly, not consciously. His hands knew. His hands had always known. He hadn't played seriously in 4 years, and his hands still knew. Hey! He opened his eyes. Hey! What are you doing? Clifford Hartwell was standing 6 feet away. He had a glass of bourbon in one hand and the expression of a man who has just discovered something offensive in a location where it should not have been possible for something offensive to appear. Lionel looked at him. "I'm sorry," Lionel said. "I was just your maintenance." Hartwell said this the way you'd say you're trespassing. "I know who you are. I've seen you here before. Get up. I apologize. I'll go." "No, I want to know." Hartwell took one step closer. His voice had gone to the particular register that people like Clifford Hartwell used when they wanted to make a scene without technically being the one making a scene. "Who gave you permission to touch that instrument? Do you have any idea what that piano is worth?" Clifford. Virginia Hartwell had materialized from somewhere. She put her hand on his arm with the practiced lightness of a woman who had been managing her husband in public for 26 years. He shook her off. "That piano is on loan from the Steinway Foundation for this event. It is not a prop. It is not a toy. It is certainly not something for." He gestured at Lionel with his glass, a short, dismissive wave that was worse than anything he could have said. Lionel Greer stood up from the bench, slowly. "Get your hands off my piano." 3 people nearby had turned to look. Then 5. Then a circle was forming the way circles always form when someone is being publicly diminished. People drawn to it like moths and equally helpless. "I don't know what you thought you were doing," Hartwell continued. He had an audience now and he was using it, his voice carrying to the edges of the circle without effort. "But I need you to understand something. There are places in this world for people like you, and there are places that aren't. This is not your place. You don't belong here. You come in here with those hands." He looked at Lionel's hands. "You come in here like you're Clifford." Sandra Obi's voice was quiet and had no give in it whatsoever. Hartwell stopped. He looked at. She was looking at him in a way that made Prescott, the assistant, take one small step backward. "Mr. Hartwell," Sandra said, "the dinner service is about to begin. Your table is ready." He looked at Lionel Greer for another moment. Then he said, "Make sure maintenance is escorted out," and walked away. The circle dissolved. Lionel stood at the piano, alone in a little cleared space of carpet, and looked down at his hands. His hands were clean. He had washed them 3 times before he left the service area, the way he always did. They were clean, and they were still, and they were 53 years old, and they had designed a bridge that 42,000 people drove across every day in the state of Virginia, and nobody in this room knew that, and right now it felt like the kind of thing that might be true and might not matter at all. He turned to walk out. "Wait!" The voice came from somewhere to his left. He turned. A man was standing near the edge of the crowd. 60s, silver-haired, the kind of face that has seen enough to have gotten calm about it. He was looking at Lionel with an expression that was not pity and was not the polished concern of someone performing decency. It was something closer to recognition. His name was Theodore Ashe. Senator Theodore Ashe, actually 3 terms from Georgia, ranking member of a subcommittee on infrastructure that Lionel had testified before exactly once, in 2017 when he was a different version of himself. Ashe walked over to Lionel. He extended his hand. Theodore Ashe. Lionel shook it. Lionel Greer. Something moved across Ashe's face. Subtle. The way a card player's expression shifts for a fraction of a second when a name registers. "The Meridian Bridge," Ashe said. "Not a question." Lionel looked at him. "I was on the committee when the Meridian was approved," Ashe said. "I read the engineering brief. Your name was on it, front page, all caps." A pause. "I read the whole thing, twice. I don't usually read the whole brief." Lionel said nothing. "What are you doing working maintenance here?" "Living my life," Lionel said. It wasn't rude. It was just true. Ashe nodded slowly. He didn't push. He was a man who understood that some answers weren't his to ask for. Instead, he looked at the piano, then back at Lionel. "Do you play?" What happened next was not dramatic, exactly. Or rather, it was dramatic in the way that genuine things are dramatic, not built toward, not orchestrated, just suddenly, irreversibly true. Ashe walked to the front of the room and spoke to the event coordinator. There was a brief conversation. Sandra Obi glanced at the piano, glanced at Lionel standing near the edge of the room, and then nodded once with the decisiveness of a woman who had spent 18 years making calls on incomplete information. The pianist in the green dress finished her piece, stood, and quietly moved her things from the bench. And Lionel Greer sat down at the Steinway concert grand. The room didn't know what to make of it. The cocktail hour murmur continued for a few seconds, the clink of glasses, the half-conversations. Hartwell, across the room at his table, was not looking in the direction of the piano. Lionel put his hands on the keys. He had started playing when he was 7 years old. His mother had found a piano teacher 2 neighborhoods over, a retired music school professor named Mrs. Elaine Ford, who charged $8 a lesson and who had recognized within the first month that Lionel Greer was not a child who needed to be taught how to play piano. He needed to be shown what piano was, and then he would do the rest himself. He had played through high school, through his engineering degree, through his graduate work, in every apartment he had ever lived in concert halls and church basements, and a hotel bar in Brussels once, late at night, after a conference. He had played at his mother's funeral. He had played at his daughter's wedding. 4 years ago, he had stopped. He would not tell you why if you asked. Some things are rooms you close the door on and do not open again until you're ready. His hands moved. He started with something simple. Not simple like easy, simple like true. A Chopin nocturne, the one in E-flat major, the one that his mother had made him play at her church's annual concert every year for 6 years until the congregation started requesting it specifically. He played it slowly, the way it wanted to be played, with the kind of patience you can only have when you have stopped trying to impress anyone. The room got quiet, not immediately, but in the way that quiet happens when something real is happening. Starting at the edges, people trailing off mid-sentence, turning without meaning to, the way animals in a field all turn their heads in the same direction for a reason none of them could explain. Lionel moved from the nocturne into something else. His own hands surprised him, a little. He hadn't planned this. He let them go where they wanted to go, which turned out to be somewhere between classical and something older. Something that lived in the body before it had a name. He was playing the way he had played in his 20s, when he didn't have an audience in his head yet, when the music was just a conversation between him and the instrument and the space between the notes. Someone put down a glass. The small click of it was the loudest sound in the room. A woman near the front began to cry. She wasn't trying to. She didn't seem to know she was doing it until she raised her hand to her face and found it wet. Hartwell, at his table, had turned around. He was watching the piano. His face was doing something complicated, something that looked like confusion, which was the closest Clifford Hartwell got to recalibration. He was a man who believed, genuinely and without much examination, that the world had arranged itself into a sensible hierarchy, and that the hierarchy was legible from the outside, that you could look at a person and know what they were. Lionel Greer in a maintenance uniform was a maintenance worker. That was the whole sentence. That was the complete thought. What was happening at that piano was not part of the sentence. He picked up his glass and then put it back down without drinking. Lionel played for 22 minutes. Nobody spoke. Nobody checked their phone. Sandra Obi, standing near the service entrance with a clipboard she had forgotten she was holding, said afterward that she had never in 18 years of events seen 400 people do nothing. They just listened, she said. 400 people. And the only sound in that room was the piano. Do you know how rare that is? When Lionel finished, he sat with his hands still on the keys for a moment. Then he lifted them and placed them in his lap. The room broke open. Not the polite applause of people who clap, because it is time to clap. The kind that starts in the chest and comes out louder than intended. Theodore Ashe was on his feet. Then the woman next to him. Then a cascade of standing that moved through the room like something tipping. Hartwell did not stand. He sat at his table with his untouched glass in front of him, and he watched the room stand around him, and his face had gone somewhere private that nobody at that table wanted to look at directly. Lionel Greer did not linger. He accepted the applause quietly, a small nod, something that was not quite a bow. And then he stood from the bench and walked toward the edge of the room. Theodore Ashe intercepted him and shook his hand and held it for a long moment without saying anything, which turned out to be exactly right. Sandra Obi found him and said, in a voice that had nothing professional in it at all, "Mr. Greer, I am so sorry about earlier," he said. "You did your job. That's not something to apologize for." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. He collected his coat from the coat check. The same girl, the one who had almost not given it back to him. She handed it over quickly this time, not making eye contact in the way of someone who has recently understood something about themselves that she wasn't fully comfortable with yet. He put on the coat, buttoned it, and walked out into the night. What happened after is what everyone else wrote about. A video clip. Shot by someone near the front during Lionel's playing. Not the whole performance, just the last 4 minutes of it, ending on the moment when the room stood. It was posted to social media at 11:43 that evening. By the following morning, it had been seen by enough people that 3 different journalists had tracked down the event and started making calls. By Tuesday, they had found Lionel Greer. The stories that ran used words like extraordinary and hidden and forgotten, which were all partially right and all slightly wrong. He had not hidden. He had not been forgotten by people who knew him. He had simply made a choice about where to put himself for a while, and the world had not been paying attention to that particular corner. The Meridian Bridge, the federal courthouse in Maryland, the hospital wing in Atlanta, his name on 22 years of work that was still standing, still being used, still holding the weight it had been built to hold. The university, the D.C. consultation that he confirmed but declined to specify. The concert programs from the 90s and early 2000s. He had played in a dozen venues, nothing major but documented, that people dug out of archives and posted online. The footage of Clifford Hartwell that someone else had shot, without realizing what they were getting, during the confrontation at the piano. The wave of the hand, the words that had been said clearly enough to capture, went up separately and moved faster. By Wednesday, 3 board members of the Whitfield Foundation had released individual statements. By Thursday, Hartwell had stepped down from the gala committee. By the following Monday, the word resigned appeared in a press release from 2 other organizations his name had been attached to, in the careful, passive voice that those press releases always use, as if resignation simply happened, like weather. Nobody called it justice. That word is too large and too complicated for what actually occurs when a man like Clifford Hartwell experiences consequences. What happened was smaller and more specific. A man had tried to make someone invisible and had instead accidentally made him visible in a way that no longer allowed for looking away. Theodore Ashe called Lionel that Thursday. Lionel was in his apartment, a 1-bedroom in a building that needed more work than the landlord was inclined to do, in a neighborhood he had chosen for reasons that had to do with quiet and morning light and a coffee shop 2 blocks away, run by a woman named Gwen who knew his order and did not make him repeat it. He answered on the 3rd ring. They talked for 40 minutes. Ashe did not offer Lionel anything. He was not that kind of man. What he did was ask questions. Careful, specific questions about the Meridian Bridge, about the hospital wing, about what Lionel thought of a proposed infrastructure bill that had been stalled in committee for 8 months. And he listened to the answers the way a man listens when he is actually adjusting his thinking and not just waiting for his turn to speak. Near the end of the call, Ashe said, "You know there are people who want to talk to you." "I know," Lionel said. "What do you want to do about that?" A pause. The refrigerator in Lionel's kitchen made the small sound it made sometimes in the evenings, a brief mechanical sigh like it, too, was thinking things over. "I don't know yet," Lionel said. "That's a fair answer," Ashe said. They agreed to talk again the following week. His daughter called that evening. Her name was Camille, and she was 31, and she lived in Portland, and she had not known about the video until a friend from college sent it to her with a message that said, "Is this your dad?" "Daddy," she said when he picked up. Just that, one word. "Hey, baby," he said. She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her composing herself. She had always done this, gathered herself before saying something that mattered, held it in for exactly 2 seconds, then let it out cleanly. "You were playing again," she said. "A little bit," he said. It wasn't a little bit. She had seen the video. He could hear in her voice that she had watched it more than once. "It wasn't a little bit, Daddy." He was quiet. "How did it feel?" she asked. Her voice had something in it that she was trying to keep to a manageable size. He thought about this seriously, the way he thought about everything. "Like remembering something I shouldn't have put down," he said. Camille was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "Yeah," and he heard in that one syllable everything she could not figure out how to say, and everything she knew he could not say either, and somehow that was sufficient. And they talked for another hour about nothing in particular, and it was fine. The baseboard in the service corridor at the Hargrove Grand held. Lionel had done it right. He always did things right. The water damage was contained, the board was flush, and the section of wall above it dried clean over the following weeks, without any of the secondary issues you usually got when that kind of repair was rushed. Darnell noticed it when they were doing a walkthrough the following month and said to the new guy, "See that? That's how you do it. Whoever did that, they did it right." Nobody told him it was Lionel Greer. Lionel was not there anymore. He had given his 2 weeks' notice on the Wednesday after the gala, professionally and without drama, in a typed letter that thanked the maintenance department for 14 months of what he called solid and meaningful work, which he meant sincerely. Manual labor had been, for the time he had needed it to be, what it was supposed to be, a thing to do with his hands while the rest of him figured out what came next. What came next was still being determined. He had 3 meetings scheduled, one with a university, one with a civil engineering firm out of Atlanta that had reached out through a mutual contact, formally and with appropriate respect, one with Ash's office, which was listed in his calendar simply as conversation, because that was what Ash had called it, and Ash seemed like a man who meant what he called things. He had not decided anything yet. He was sitting at the window of his apartment on a Thursday morning, coffee from Gwen's 2 blocks away still warm in his hand, watching the street below. A woman walking a dog, a kid on a bike, the ordinary continuing motion of a city that does not arrange itself around any one person's private reckoning, when he realized that what he felt, underneath the noise of the past week, was not triumph. It was something quieter, like a room where the windows had been opened after a long time, and the air was moving through it again, and the room was the same room it had always been, unchanged, just breathing. His phone was on the table. He looked at it, and then looked back out the window. The woman with the dog turned the corner and was gone. He finished his coffee. Then he picked up the phone and called back the university.